Skyrim is the best-selling RPG ever made. So, why has no one copied it? Now, I'm not saying that I want the gaming industry to just copy successful things. I'm saying that's what it already does, and that's how it's been for as long as I remember. There were GTA killers, Halo killers, and WoW killers, but no Skyrim killer. There's been Doom clones, Minecraft clones, and Diablo clones, but no Elder Scrolls clones. And we've had Souls-likes and roguelikes and Vampire Survivor-likes, but no Scrolls-like. Which doesn't make sense. The industry chases trends, and a lot of money is made in the process. This is what led to Fortnite and League of Legends, and Breath of the Wild, and Rock Band, and Mortal Kombat, and Sonic the Goddamn Hedgehog. Successful things get copied. The industry chases trends. Except this one. So, why? Skyrim is about as successful as a game can be. It's not just the best-selling RPG, it's the 8th best-selling game of all time, likely the best-selling single-player game ever made, and its success is still going. It sold well, reviewed well, won awards, and created an unfortunate number of unfunny memes, but Skyrim wasn't just popular when it released, it's still popular today. It's still selling on consoles, and it's still amongst Steam's most played, with a player count that, if anything, seems to be trending upwards, not down. And in some ways, that's not a surprise. Of course, people keep playing it, people keep buying it, and Bethesda keeps releasing it, because it still doesn't have any real competition. Not even from Bethesda themselves, who disappointed their own fans with their own follow-ups and have shown nothing of an official sequel since a 30-second title reveal, which happened almost 7 years ago now. Skyrim's also not exactly unkillable. Even its biggest fans would probably admit that its combat is weak, its role-playing is often basic, and its story leaves room for improvement. Hell, even its presentation feels dated. Almost like it's a game that first released over 13 years ago. But it doesn't need to be literally killed. This is not like competing with a multiplayer game where you need to win over an already entrenched audience. There is room in the market for new single-player games to exist side by side. And yet, Skyrim stands alone. So maybe the gaming industry fucked up. Maybe a AAA Elder Scrolls clone was a real money-making opportunity that just happened to get overlooked. And maybe if but a fraction of the funds that were poured into failed battle royales and short-lived live service attempts was instead thrown at a talented studio with the right direction, then this video wouldn't exist. But it wasn't. Still, even when mainstream gaming messes up, that still shouldn't be enough, because in modern times, indie does what AAA don't. And so, indie games fill the holes mainstream gaming leaves open, because holes mean opportunities. And with over 10,000 games releasing on Steam each year, and 13 years since Skyrim released, that's a lot of potential opportunities. And yet, even an indie Elder Scrolls hasn't really appeared. And so, despite all these years, despite so much opportunity, and despite the clear demand, it's still hard to find anything that feels like a successor to the Elder Scrolls. Although, that hasn't stopped people from looking. Avowed is no Skyrim. So why did everyone act like it was? Avowed was first announced 5 years ago. Its reveal trailer showed a fantasy world and a first-person perspective, and every single top comment on this trailer referred to it as Obsidian's Elder Scrolls. The games media did the same, calling it the next Skyrim or a Skyrim-style RPG, and YouTubers, of course, joined in as well. And so, from the moment it was revealed to the public decided this game must be like Skyrim, maybe out of their long-held desire for a successor more than anything else, and poor Obsidian was simply burdened with these unfair expectations ever since. Except, Obsidian knew what they were doing. This teaser shows little and says less, but every single part of it that does communicate something seems to be begging for these comparisons. Avowed's world is only glimpsed, but that glimpse shows something big and open. The flavour of medieval fantasy and the dark tone would fit right into Tamriel, and the trailer ends by descending into a dungeon, the most Skyrim-like of all locations, before showing a dual-wielding first-person perspective, rarely seen in fantasy RPGs, but regularly seen in the Elder Scrolls. What's more, when Obsidian marketed the Outer Worlds, they encouraged the idea that it was Obsidian's answer to the Bethesda-owned Fallout, almost priming people to see this new announcement as Obsidian's answer to the other Bethesda RPG giant. Obsidian had control here, and they chose to show this game in this particular way. They then did nothing to discourage these comparisons in the press releases and interviews that followed, even though they could have, maybe because comparisons to the best-selling RPG ever made are good marketing. So, it seems Obsidian were just being deceptive. Except that's still not the whole story. You see, Avowed, as we know it today, might be no Skyrim, but the Avowed that began development in 2018 was something else entirely. The story, as reported by Jason Schreier, goes that Obsidian were facing financial difficulties at this time and looking for buyers. Avowed was then pitched in this period in hopes of attracting said buyers, and so to attract them, Obsidian did what the big boys of the gaming industry often do. They chased trends. Avowed was meant to be a cross between best-selling RPG ever Skyrim and infinite money-making live service darling Destiny. So basically it was to be Obsidian's magnum opus, a multiplayer live service Skyrim, to compete alongside other RPG magnum opuses, like BioWare's Anthem, Bethesda's Fallout 76, and CD Projekt's Cyberpunk 2077, which once featured extensive multiplayer elements. These games are all part of the same trend. In the 2010s, live service games proved to be hugely profitable, and so successful RPG makers tried to combine successful RPGs with the successful live service model to very little actual success. And it seems Avowed shared that lack of success, as while the pitch might have worked in attracting a buyout from Microsoft, development still ran into troubles, with the multiplayer component being removed completely before the project's leadership was replaced and the entire game rebooted in 2021, sometime after that original Elder Scrolls-like trailer. As part of this reboot, a decision was made to create something less like Skyrim and more like Obsidian's other games, and so the open world was changed to being zone-based, and the original open-ended design gave way to linearity, as Obsidian's take on Skyrim transformed into Obsidian's take on a fantasy Outer Worlds. This is the Avowed people know and love today. But while the game might have changed, as in-development games often do, the narrative of it being like Skyrim stuck around. And so people made comparisons. These showed up in the positive reviews, and they showed up in the negative ones, and they showed up on YouTube, where videos were made outlining all the things that Skyrim does that Avowed doesn't. Being compared to the best-selling RPG of all time likely sets high expectations that many probably felt were not met. And to make Avowed's situation worse, it also found controversy for its woke elements, with even Elon Musk getting involved to amplify the outrage. This created an even larger target on the game, with many people probably happy to pile on to the Elder Scrolls comparisons as an easy way to dunk on the game.
This is insane because Bethesda has always been like the gold standard of goofy game design. And so it's like if you're getting mogged by Bethesda in a game mechanics competition,
it's actually worse than a 19-year-old game.
Avowed is no Skyrim. So what is it? I mean, in many ways, the comparisons make sense. Both games are open world, both have action combat, both have first and third person perspectives, both are set in a D&D inspired medieval fantasy setting, both try to be accessible, both have too many bears. On the surface, the similarities are obvious. But to understand why Avowed isn't a Skyrim killer, it's better to look at Skyrim itself. Because the real answer to this question is that Avowed is a fairly normal RPG, something close to the modern RPG standard, which can make it feel a little derivative as a result. Its open world is split into 4 different zones that you progress through in a linear fashion, where each is higher level than the last. Each zone features exactly 1 town, separated by a loading screen, which acts as a place to pick up side quests, access shops, and little else. The side quests themselves feature familiar genre staples like bounties, treasure maps, and tasks given by NPCs who turn out to not be telling you the whole truth. Who could see that coming? The main story makes the player an unwilling chosen one and is split into acts that correspond to each zone, with each one culminating in a single big moral choice for the player to make. Companion stories happen through exposition dumps at camp, alongside the one designated companion quest. Combat features for typical dodging and blocking alongside cooldown-based abilities. The class system gives you a choice of just fighter, ranger, or wizard, with generic skill trees for each. Loot uses a color system to show quality. Crafting feels added out of obligation. The game features far too many in-game notes to pick up, almost as if it's compensating for something. The ending has a Fallout-style slideshow to show you the consequences to your choices. Avowed is modern RPG, the video game, which you could say makes it a bit disappointing, because once upon a time, Obsidian had a reputation for creating RPGs that went against genre conventions and felt genuinely introspective as a result. And while you could criticize these games for many things, being generic was never one of them. But this video is not about Obsidian, so I won't say any of that. Skyrim can also be criticized for many things, but none of that criticism will ever take away how unique Elder Scrolls games feel. If I had to sum up what makes these games different in just 2 words, it would be freedom and immersion. They do have other important features. They are large and accessible, they have deep lore, they feature great environmental design and some incredible music, but these are things you can find in other open world games as well. The freedom and immersion you generally can't. There are few RPGs where you can completely ignore the main story and still feel like you're getting the intended experience. Yet, in the Elder Scrolls, not only can you say no to the hero's call to adventure to write your own story instead, but this even seems to be encouraged. The world is fully open, the player begins right in the middle of it, and most enemies and challenges scale to your level, so that any direction is the right direction. This makes the world feel even larger and full of even more possibilities, while providing a truly player-driven experience. Go anywhere and do anything is an impossible promise for a video game to make, but the Elder Scrolls comes far closer than most at fulfilling it. It also features a world that is more simulated. Every building has an interior, every NPC has a routine, and every item has a model that can be picked up and moved. The world can also seem genuinely alive. Sometimes enemies moving through it will attack other enemies. Sometimes dragons will attack towns. And sometimes players will attack towns, where you can kill everyone. Well, almost everyone. Or end up in jail for committing crimes, or get married, buy a house, and get some unkillable NPCs of your own. Skyrim doesn't always use its systems to their full emergent potential, but most other RPGs don't even have these systems or features to misuse. And this makes Skyrim's world immersive in a way most other game worlds simply aren't. And so, if a game is to be a true Skyrim killer, it can't just be another large open world RPG, even if it's a great open world RPG. Instead, it has to offer the features unique to the Elder Scrolls, and compete with its inspiration either in freedom, or immersion, or both. Avowed does not do this, but it's not because it's a bad game, it's because it doesn't actually try. Take immersion. Again and again, Avowed looks at realism and deliberately sacrifices it for the benefit of gameplay. This is why sprinting costs no stamina. It's why climbing is inhumanly fast and easy. It's why almost every hard-to-reach location has its own special chest to reward you for reaching it. And it's why all of these chests make a special sound effect to beckon you close to them. I mean, I don't know if anyone has ever noticed, but chests don't actually do this in real life. It's also why items you pick up are color coordinated according to their epicness, and why almost no item you pick up adds any carry weight, and why there's no slow Red Dead Redemption 2-like animations for everything. It's why the minimap conveniently highlights both enemies and interactable items for you, and why you don't need arrows or ammunition to shoot, and why wild animals don't notice you if you crouch down and walk up behind them. Good luck stealth killing a bear in real life. Avowed's design prioritizes gameplay over immersion, and this isn't just shown in what Avowed does, but also what it doesn't. This is why NPCs don't go to sleep at night, and why NPCs don't react to enemies, and why they don't react to the player stealing in front of them. Creating a living world was clearly not a priority during development, and so Avowed doesn't even try. Which is a bit ironic given the name of the setting, but these systems are difficult to implement, and so a decision was clearly made to use development resources elsewhere. This is the same reason Avowed lacks Skyrim's freedom. The original vision involved a fully open world, but in an interview, Avowed's director said the change to zones was decided on to allow for greater narrative control. And so, just as gameplay was prioritized over immersion, so was story over freedom. And the result is something that is not trying to beat Skyrim at its own game. As for the game Avowed is trying to be, there are things it does do better than Skyrim. Like combat, which at least feels good while providing more options than the low bar of the best-selling RPG of all time. Or environmental interactivity, which allows for some basic puzzle design and includes climbing to create a more vertical and dense world that rewards actually exploring locations rather than just following compass markers. Or its focus on its main story, which is longer and more involved than Skyrim's. Really, Avowed is okay at what it's trying to do. It's just what it's trying to do is not what many people wanted or expected, and it's not exceptional enough at doing its own thing to get away with that. Still, the solution to Avowed's problems don't lie in Skyrim's design. If this game was changed to include some of the most focused on missing features, like NPC routines or consequences to stealing, it wouldn't suddenly become the game people want it to be because so little of it is designed to be that game. Likewise, if you tried to fix Avowed by making it prioritize immersion over gameplay, and remove things like the convenient sound effect chests make to help you find them, or the lack of carry weight for most items, it wouldn't make this game better at being Skyrim, it would just be worse at being Avowed. Instead, the easiest way to turn Avowed from good to great would be to focus on what it already does well and make these parts better. Improve combat through greater enemy variety, improve exploration with Breath of the Wild style environmental interactivity and puzzles, improve progression through more depth with features like enchantable armor or actual companion gear, improve the skill system by having more than the standard 3 basic bitch classes, improve the writing by not prioritizing quantity over quality all the time and bringing back Obsidian's once characteristic self-awareness. The path to a better game lies in what Avowed already does. But at least Avowed is good at showing how hard making a modern Elder Scrolls clone must be. Immersive systems and expansive details demand development resources most games can't afford, and when the challenges of development kick in, story and gameplay might understandably take priority. This is not the first time an ambitious RPG took inspiration from Skyrim, only to become less like Skyrim during development. In an interview during the development of The Witcher 3, it was claimed that Skyrim was the main inspiration for the game's new open world, with the stated goal being to take Skyrim's world design and combine it with The Witcher's stronger storytelling. The end result, however, has more in common with Ubisoft's style of world design, with copy-pasted points of interest, message boards that take the role of Ubisoft's watchtowers to give you map information about your surroundings, and a more linear level progression that follows the main story on a designated path through the world, instead of go anywhere and do anything. Interestingly, Assassin's Creed 3 was also mentioned in this interview as being another game CD Projekt looked at for inspiration. Meanwhile, some Skyrim-like systems, such as stealing, can still be seen in The Witcher 3, they just seem half-finished and largely ignored by the quest design, almost as if they were abandoned mid-development. A similar story can be seen with Dragon Age Inquisition, which again went open world after the developers were inspired by Skyrim, only to end up featuring a world with zones and hubs, alongside a packed quest log with objectives that can be knocked off simultaneously, making its world design more reminiscent of MMOs like World of Warcraft than the Elder Scrolls. And if the likes of BioWare, CD Projekt, and Obsidian find the Elder Scrolls world design too difficult to be worth replicating, what hope do even smaller studios have? The last 10 years have given gamers indie versions of almost everything once popular, but for a long time, indie Scrolls-likes were noticeably absent from this. In recent years, this has finally started to change, with several games currently in early access, several more announced as in development, and a few even having been released already. On the one hand, these games face an obvious challenge, which is the difficulty of replicating something big and complex on a modest budget. Creating indie Skyrim is a big ask. On the other hand, though, The Elder Scrolls was popular before Skyrim, and if Daggerfall was possible in 1996 and Morrowind in 2002, then maybe an indie Elder Scrolls doesn't need the biggest budget to capture what makes this series special. Maybe. Dread Delusion is not indie Skyrim, but that might be because it takes influence from a different Elder Scrolls game instead. You begin in the classic Elder Scrolls way, i.e. as a prisoner waiting to gain your freedom, but the world around you is rather less familiar. Dread Delusion is set on a cluster of floating islands in a world where the surface has been torn asunder and rendered uninhabitable by some distant disaster. The player finds themselves on an Inquisition ship where you're soon tasked with hunting down the infamous criminal, Vela, as penance for your past crimes. The search for Vela makes up the majority of the main story, but it's the setting itself that makes Dread Delusion so memorable. Still, the first thing that stands out about this game is the vibes. Giant mushrooms might conjure memories of Morrowind, but there is much more than fungus that makes this world weird. Floating land masses, pink skies, mysterious flying beasts, the strangeness of the Inquisition, and the High Confessor you soon report to, who seems stuck inside a bleeding Iron Maiden, are all barely scratching the surface of what this world has to offer. This is then combined with haunting music, a gorgeous retro aesthetic, and a permanent psychedelic shimmer to everything that you can turn off in the options if you want, but you shouldn't, because that disorienting shimmer is a part of the vibe. Dread Delusion is dripping with an atmosphere that stays compelling all the way to the game's conclusion. Once you've received your main objective from the High Confessor, you make your way through a lengthy tutorial section as you infiltrate a large fortress where Vela is located, only for your target to escape by airship, leaving your mission unfulfilled and opening up the world more fully. There is a moment in each Elder Scrolls game that I like to think of as the Elder Scrolls moment. Creative name, I know. The Elder Scrolls moment is that moment when the freedom of the world is first unlocked. In Morrowind, this is when the player steps out of the Imperial Census Office into Seyda-Neen. In Oblivion, this is when you exit the sewer, and in Skyrim, this is after you escape Helgen and exit the first dungeon. To me, these are the single most important and iconic moments in each of these games, and it feels like each one is designed to pull the player in and capture the tone of the rest of the experience. Be it strange and uncaring, idyllic and inviting, or epic and majestic. More than this, however, these moments are where the go anywhere, do anything principle is at its realest and most tantalizing. And so in many ways, these feel like the moments that define each of these games. In Dread Delusion, the equivalent moment comes as you descend from the fortress and step out into the mushroom forest below. And the world does stretch before you impressively. The tone is as haunting and intriguing as ever, and there is freedom to go in different directions and explore on your own. But it's not quite a true Elder Scrolls moment. Dread Delusion's world is split into 4 main zones, with several other smaller islands, and you'll basically proceed from one zone to the next in a linear order. The world is also big, but it's not Elder Scrolls big, and it doesn't have the same quantity of side quests that can allow you to truly ignore the main story and still feel like you're getting a full experience. And so, instead of the freedom to go anywhere, you're instead limited to just exploring the first major zone, and instead of do anything, it's more like follow the main story and get involved with many optional side quests along the way if you want to, just like in most RPGs. That said, there are ways Dread Delusion's world design does impress, and features that aid with immersion, like the fatigue system, which slowly lowers your max stamina over time to encourage players to regularly return to a bed and rest, or the more limited fast travel, which involves using teleporting mirrors, mage portals, and player magic, all of which you have to slowly unlock and discover over time to make traversal feel more realistic and meaningful. Or the more involved map system, where you must first find a blank map and then buy a compass to unlock the player's position, and then draw in the actual map by going to different major landmarks. Or just the lack of quest markers. Icons telling you exactly where to go are not immersive and end up removing much of the thinking and gameplay inherent to exploration. Dread Delusion instead forces players to follow simple directions and look for landmarks, and yet this never comes off as frustrating or overly cryptic, like, say, how Morrowind does at times. The world is also fully seamless, which feels particularly impressive when you travel great distances or reach great heights, while always being able to see the rest of the world unfolding around you in a way that even AAA games would struggle to do, but which Dread Delusion can pull off thanks to its lower graphical fidelity. Despite this, Dread Delusion is still a lower budget game, and so doesn't have the extensive feature list many blockbuster open world games might boast. Instead, it feels like a simplification of open-world RPG design that tries to maintain the most important features while leaving behind any excess. Like hands. You have no hands. Your items just float. Probably because hands would be annoying to animate. And that's fine. Nobody needs hands in a first-person game. But if you do need hands in your first-person game, Dread Delusion probably isn't for you. You weakling. The hands do rather represent Dread Delusion, however, because this game has little filler, even when it's filler people might expect. There are also few simulation elements. NPCs don't have routines, although there is a day and night cycle with meaningful differences between the two. Items aren't physically modelled, and are instead often placed in a distinctly gamey and unrealistic way throughout the world, and generally Dread Delusion only includes what it needs. Except for the airship. The airship is pretty extra, and annoying to control, but travelling about anywhere freely like this is pretty cool. The main RPG systems players would expect are still present though. The game features 4 attributes that govern 8 skills, which affect both combat and non-combat. Through these different skills, the game provides an impressive amount of non-linearity to its quest design, as different skills can open up different options. For example, you can lockpick your way through locked doors, but you can also smash many doors with a high enough might attribute. Agility improves jump distance, allowing you to climb past some barriers. Lore determines whether you can successfully interact with magical and mechanical items. Charm provides more options through speech checks, and so on. Initially, this feels really well done, and the quality over quantity gear upgrades make item progression feel impactful, while the faction and reputation systems give a great sense of consequence to the player's choices and actions. The experience system itself is the most atypical feature, as instead of earning traditional experience points, all level advancement comes from gaining items called Delusions. These can be given for completing quests, but are often found as physical items in the world as a reward for exploration. And so, exploration really is rewarded in the most literal way, incentivizing you to pay attention to the environment, investigate points of interest, and find a way to reach any hard-to-access areas. When you also take into account the lack of quest markers, this creates an experience where exploration feels like the main aspect of gameplay. But this game wants you to explore more than just its open world. Dread Delusion's best quality is its lore, and throughout the game you dig deeper and deeper into this setting as you uncover more and more of its secrets, and meet more and more of its desperate and dejected inhabitants. The Sky Realms are fucked up, and their problems are both cosmic and horrifying. This is a place where Lovecraftian entities, or gods, tempt humans with power in exchange for worship and sacrifice. 40 years prior, humanity rose up to slay these gods after discovering that their source of power was anything but divine. But now, the dominant apostatic union, through the brutal enforcement of the Inquisition, seem to commit just as many atrocities as these outlawed gods, all in the name of preserving order and obliterating heresy. That High Confessor from earlier isn't just inside that coffin because it's metal as fuck. They're inside it because they once sinned, and the coffin inflicts continual pain that blocks out the tempting whispers of the gods. And plenty of people in this world are doing even worse than the High Confessor. And so exploring Dread Delusion allows you to peel back this world's history, of which there are various and sometimes contradictory accounts for, while taking in its many memorable sights, like the definitely not sentient flesh farms or the Kafkaesque Clockwork Kingdom. This all leads to some of the hardest to make choices I have ever seen in a video game. Choices that had me changing my mind as I learnt more information, and second-guessing myself as my perspective gradually evolved over the course of the game. Dread Delusion is about suffering and hope, and while it asks many questions, it never gives any easy answers. The writing also seems to get better with each new zone you reach, but unfortunately, the gameplay is the exact opposite. Dread Delusion's Achilles heel is the combat, which is basic and lacking in challenge, with players able to hit enemies and then easily backpedal to avoid most counterattacks. Basically, like Daggerfall, now that I think about it. Fortunately, there is a hard mode that was added in a post-launch update. Unfortunately, hard mode was what I was already playing, and it's hard mode that completely lacks challenge, so presumably normal mode is somehow even worse. Fortunately, this game isn't really about the combat, and there are non-combat paths and solutions to most quests. Unfortunately, the non-combat path often just involves running past enemies, which is also incredibly easy because you can sprint fast with no stamina requirement, meaning all enemies can basically be ignored. It's this lack of challenge that ends up being the main problem. Great RPGs can have bad combat. Morrowind is one such example, but Morrowind's gameplay still feels functional as it still challenges the player while giving meaning to progression and adding danger to the world. Dread Delusion has none of this, and its world feels overly safe and flat as a result. This is made even worse by how the story establishes this setting as a dangerous place full of suffering and desperate struggles to survive, but you never feel that as a player when you can just kill or avoid any threat with ease. There's no manual saving in Dread Delusion, presumably to force players to live with the consequences of their actions, and initially this felt intimidating and made me overly cautious. The first time I found a plant, I stayed away from it because it looked dangerous and I didn't want to lose too much health or die. So basically, I was spooked by a flower, which shows the power of fear of the unknown. I just wish that feeling had lasted beyond the first couple hours. This lack of difficulty also bleeds into other areas, with the skill system that starts so strong ending up being overly generous, with players able to pass most later skill checks easily, and resources increasingly going unused as you find so many, making progression rather empty. It could even impact the story, as something important happens the first time you die, yet the only time I actually did die was when I accidentally fell off an island whilst admiring the view. I guess I was lucky to fall, but this doesn't feel like something which should require luck. There should be at least a chance for enemies to kill you, particularly on hard mode. Combat is clearly not the main point of Dread Delusion, and killing enemies doesn't even give XP, but it's in this flawed gameplay and the overall lack of challenge where this game feels furthest behind the Elder Scrolls. Which is a strange thing to say given how most feel about combat in that series, but Dread Delusion is a low-budget indie game, and combat is where that becomes most obvious. Still, people don't usually play these games for their combat, so outside of this one problem, how successful is Dread Delusion as an Elder Scrolls successor? The answer is not very. Which, again, is because that's not really what Dread Delusion is trying to be. This game uses an Elder Scrolls-like shell that it then fills with its own more simplified gameplay and systems, all for the purpose of creating an exploration-based experience that allows its memorable story and setting to shine. And they do, oh so brightly, but that still doesn't create a truly Elder Scrolls-like experience. Dread Delusion is far more focused on its main story and lacks that go-anywhere-do-anything freedom. Parts of its design do emphasize immersion, and the lore helps bring this setting to life, but its systems are still simple, and its scope is limited, as you might expect from its indie status. And yet, Dread Delusion shows just how much is possible on a limited budget. If the point is to make a captivating world to explore and get lost in, Dread Delusion is a strong success, and it shows that a lot of the ingredients necessary for a Skyrim killer could work on an indie budget. Great art design and atmosphere can make up for lower fidelity. Lower fidelity can lead to an equally impressive scale. Scale could provide freedom if that was the priority, and strong writing can still carry an experience even when gameplay repeatedly fails. Dread Delusion proves an indie Skyrim is at least possible, even if it doesn't happen to be this game. But what if a game was intentionally trying to be like Skyrim and had a little bit more budget to work with? Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon, wants to be an indie Skyrim. Or at least, its marketing wants it to be, which is understandable as marketing an indie game is difficult and Skyrim is popular. And if YouTube is any indication, Tainted Grail has been very successful at this.
An indie Skyrim. You'll be looting in a very Skyrim-like fashion.
If you liked exploring Skyrim, the open world design concept is super similar.
Now, the term that a lot of people have used to describe this is indie Skyrim. The level up system here, by the way, very much like Skyrim.
I feel like Skyrim walked so that Tainted Grail can run.
There are a lot of favorable comparisons to Skyrim that have been made about this game on this platform, which made me feel like I had to include it even if it's still in early access. I usually avoid playing games until they receive a full release, so keep this early access label in mind. The version I played was 0.9, the final patch before release. That full release is expected soon, but this did mean I was only able to judge the game on its first of 3 total acts, which is about the first 20 to 25 hours. So maybe some of the many things I'm about to criticize will be improved in the future. The Fall of Avalon is not the first Tainted Grail video game, nor is it the first Fall of Avalon game, as a well-regarded board game of the same name preceded it, and the shared Tainted Grail setting is one of this game's stronger features. It's basically a mix of Arthurian legend, Celtic mythology, and Elden Ring-like exaggerated dark fantasy, and some of the art design this leads to is great. The premise also feels like something straight out of a From Software game. The story goes that King Arthur once claimed the land of Avalon for his people and built a great kingdom there. But now, Arthur is gone and the kingdom falls to ruin, while a new dangerous plague called the Red Death spreads across the land, leading to death, insanity, and worse. You play as one such plague victim who has been locked away in a remote prison due to the disease, leading to another Scrollsian prison escape opening after a helpful stranger frees you from your cell. One of the first things you might notice about the Fall of Avalon is that it's quite inconsistent. There are some cutscenes and environments that look fantastic and feel almost AAA quality, which does a lot to establish a strong mood and tone. But then there are basic features you would expect that are just absent, like any kind of tooltip for the many items you'll pick up. This means you can't tell how valuable or heavy items are, and will have to clumsily open the inventory page to manually check if equipment you find is better than what you currently have. And this kind of dichotomy is Tainted Grail in a nutshell. The quantity of voice acting in this game is seriously impressive, but the presentation during dialogue often feels basic and flat. The amount of optional notes you can find in the environment is impressive, but the actual writing is mixed, and the sheer amount of these notes drastically slows down the pacing if you do stop to read them all. The number of optional boss fights in the intro dungeon is impressive, but the one non-optional boss fight is terrible. I tried to fight it in melee range, but found the hitboxes wildly inconsistent, with attacks that should hit me missing and attacks that shouldn't hitting. So then I tried to do this fight at range, only to find out that once I got far enough away, the boss just gave up and stood still, while I very slowly fireballed it to death. This first dungeon itself is overall too long, And this is the tutorial dungeon, it shouldn't be this much of a slog. But then there's this one bit with these giants in the background pushing some mechanism, and I don't know why these giants are in this prison to begin with. I mean, just how big is this place? But even so, they do look cool. I like the giants. There are great details in this game, but it is consistently inconsistent. The other thing you might soon notice is superficial similarities to the Elder Scrolls. I mean, look at the lockpicking. This isn't lockpicking like Skyrim. This is Skyrim's lockpicking. The only difference is a minor visual change, with emphasis on the minor part. Other things you might expect also show up, like having the ability to pick up unnecessary junk, or the exact same stealth system. As you get further into the game, similarities become less apparent, but before that can happen, you'll have to actually escape the prison. At the end of this dungeon, you go through a dreamlike sequence that ends with meeting King Arthur himself, who seems to be suffering from amnesia and accompanies you as an entity in your mind. This makes him a bit like Johnny Silverhand, and much like Johnny, he's also kind of a dick. The main story then seems to focus on restoring Arthur's power, or helping to destroy him, with different factions in this broken land tending to be pro or anti-Camelot for you to align with or oppose. After this, you leave the prison by boat, only to be shipwrecked, leading you to wash up on shore on the first of 3 zones. This is Tainted Grail's Elder Scrolls moment, but you cannot go anywhere nor do anything. The beach you find yourself on offers some freedom to explore along the coast, with some optional enemy encounters and areas to loot, but the map design quickly constrains you if you wander too far, and instead acts to funnel you towards a nearby castle, which acts as the game's first settlement. This castle is where you want to go, as it's here you can pick up all of the side quests, and if you did try to stubbornly ignore the main quest and explore in your own way, you'd find that as you move further away from this bottom corner of the map, enemies quickly become too high level to kill easily. This first zone is also not particularly large, being more like an Avowed zone without the verticality. And so Tainted Grail really doesn't offer an Elder Scrolls-like level of freedom. The castle does actually try to create a living world, however, with consequences for stealing and NPC routines, features noticeably missing from Avowed, and it also looks really good, particularly from a distance. The actual experience of reaching this settlement quickly becomes a chore, however, as this game absolutely bombards you with side quests, which you're even forced to engage with to actually continue the main story. This creates a serious pacing problem, as it can take hours speaking to every NPC, picking up quest after quest, with little interactive gameplay to break up this monotony. And by the time you're done, you'll have a full quest log of about 20 different tasks, but may well be struggling to remember which objective corresponds to which NPC, as they all start to blur together in one big mess. You can then head off into the open world to work through your task list efficiently, which feels rather MMO-like, and some side quests are even generic enough to be at home in your average MMO. In fact, Tainted Grail might have benefited from copying MMOs more directly, as MMOs at least know to split their quests up into batches, where instead of giving players all 20 at once, they instead come in groups of 5 or so that lead to 5 more after completion, and so on, to benefit the pacing. Regardless, it's in the open world that Tainted Grail picks back up again, as the combat is, at least, better than Skyrim. Describing that combat isn't so easy, as while the heavy reliance on stamina management might lead to further Dark Souls comparisons, the pacing is surprisingly fast, more so than even the fastest Souls-likes. As a result, you run out of stamina very quickly, but also regain stamina just as fast, which feels more mechanical than methodical. Likewise, basic features like dodging are incredibly effective, but the sheer number of enemies you can end up taking on at once, and the variety of their attacks, including ranged attacks that most enemies will switch to when at distance, stop combat from feeling too easy. Overall, there is potential here, but it's also messy, and difficult to judge off the first act alone. Messy also describes the balance. At low levels, using magic to kill enemies felt incredibly slow. This may be because magic simply starts weak and only picks up with heavy skill investment, but the fact that I decided to play as a hybrid sword and shield / magic user, only to abandon both the shield and all magic because they seemed so ineffective compared to other options, makes me think the balance isn't where it's meant to be. The skill system is interesting though, as while it utilizes a fairly standard choice of different skill trees, with skill points given on level up, each skill tree is fairly large, and there are a lot of them, which combine to give players a huge amount of choice in build right from the very start. You currently have no way to respec skill choices, so after investing into one-handed on the assumption I'd be using a shield, I was forced to pivot into dual wielding to prevent my one-handed skills being wasted, but I was still able to combine this with a lot of crit-based skills to create some semblance of a unique and effective build that felt like my own. This does feel like the sort of game where you should be able to respec, however, because the skill system offers plenty of interesting build potential that can't really be tested otherwise. And once more, Tainted Grail is a game that tends to prioritize gameplay over immersion. For example, there is a ton of loot in this game, but it's not the Elder Scrolls reason of creating a simulated world. Instead, almost all loot is directly useful here, and it's best to just spam loot everything. Materials and ingredients can be added to a shared storage system that you can craft from without withdrawing, and crafting is percentage-based, where the more materials you use, the higher the chance you have of getting a better item. Meanwhile, extra monster drops can be turned in at various druid shrines to convert directly into bonus XP, and junk can be quickly sold. This world is packed with loot, but it's not to benefit immersion, it's to benefit progression. And loot is color coordinated with constant gear upgrades in a way which feels more Diablo than Skyrim. The exploration-based experience of kill, loot, teleport back to hand in side quest and then repeat also feels decidedly different from the more organic wandering the world according to your whims of the Elder Scrolls, but there is one way this might feel similar to Skyrim. Tainted Grail is a game where you can just focus on combat and looting, while largely ignoring any story and have an alright time. Meanwhile, Skyrim is a game where you are meant to care about the story and lore and all of the finer details, but you don't have to. Bethesda games are rare examples of RPGs where you can just ignore all story, turn off your brain, and just wander around killing and looting while still having an alright time. In that way, Tainted Grail might feel similar, but that's hardly enough to make this an indie Skyrim. Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, doesn't give you the freedom to go anywhere. The world's not more immersive than its peers. The first zone alone feels small and doesn't offer a strong exploration-based experience, and this seems to be mostly a combat and loot-based game, with an interesting but not remarkable dark fantasy aesthetic. I'm actually quite surprised just how many YouTubers are calling this game indie Skyrim, but then again, the lockpicking is identical, so I guess that basically makes it the same game. You can't argue with a lockpicking minigame. Ironically, a better description for this game might be indie Avowed, because outside of the tone and art style, there are many similarities between them. I guess indie Avowed probably isn't as good marketing, however. The other thing which stands out about Tainted Grail is how it contrasts with the previous game in this video. If Delusion is a minimalist take on an Elder Scrolls-like RPG, where that minimalism is sometimes to the game's detriment, Tainted Grail instead shows a maximalist approach, but this is again often to its detriment. Tainted Grail does many different things, and it tries to do them all with close to big budget levels of presentation. There is loads of voice acting and cutscenes and enemies and boss fights and notes and side quests and features. You have stealth and stealing and horse riding and home ownership and so on. So there is a lot going on here. But an indie game means having an indie budget, and so not everything here gets the attention it deserves. Tainted Grail has many solid parts that are struggling to come together, and it's hard to not question whether that's because this game simply tries to do too much rather than focusing on a few things that it knows it can do well and building everything else around this. And this seems to be one of the biggest challenges with creating a true indie Skyrim, because if a game plays to the strengths of the indie genre and does less so that it can do those things better, then it will struggle to match Skyrim's scope or scale. And yet, if an indie game does try to match Skyrim in every way, then it's left trying to do too many things on too small a budget, which almost forces it to make sacrifices or do many things badly. This seems to be the lesson that Delusion and Tainted Grail teach, and maybe making an indie Skyrim is just too challenging a task. But what if there was a different way to create an Elder Scrolls successor? What if there was a way to save on a lot of those development costs and avoid creating complicated immersive systems from scratch? Maybe by reusing already existing assets, or maybe using substantially more than that. So, what if the answer doesn't lie with a commercial project at all? Gothic is no Skyrim. But there was a time when Gothic and the Elder Scrolls existed side by side, as two exciting takes on what an open-world action RPG could be. Gothic 2 released in the same year as Morrowind, and was a great game. But while the Elder Scrolls would go on to reach even loftier heights, Gothic proved less fortunate. Gothic 3 was ambitious but disappointing. Gothic 4 was unambitious and even more disappointing. Original developer Piranha Bytes' actual attempts at successors in Risen, Elix, and their various sequels were somewhat better, but they weren't the successor to Gothic 2 many fans longed for, and for a long time, it seemed like that true successor would never exist. Until it did. The Chronicles of Myrtana Arkelos is a total conversion mod for Gothic 2, made by fans and released for free in 2021. It's also one of the best RPGs of the decade. The Chronicles of Myrtana is the Gothic successor there never was, and it is arguably even better than its inspiration. So why couldn't the same happen with Skyrim? After all, there is no modding community as large or active as Skyrim's, and modders have created numerous great standalone games over the years. So, if neither the mainstream gaming industry nor the indie scene will create a true Elder Scrolls successor, what about mods? And amongst the many impressive Skyrim mods, there is one that stood out beyond all others. One game ambitious enough to create something of a comparable size, with a development team experienced enough to see such an ambitious project through to its conclusion. And that game is Enderal, The Shards of Order, which is called Enderal Forgotten Stories on Steam, but make sure to download the special edition version if you can, because it runs much better. Don't be like me and download the wrong version, because that's the one you added to your wishlist 6 years ago. Although, if you do, you can copy over saves. Enderal originally released in 2016, but it's received updates and expansions since, and it is not the first game from developer Sure AI, or the first game set in this universe. Neharim at Fate's Edge was a total conversion mod for Oblivion that released in 2010, which I have also played, and Arctwend and Maya Aranath are total conversion Morrowind mods that released even earlier, and all of these are set in the same world of Vin. The fact that these games were being made for the better part of 2 decades should show how much the developers care about the lore behind these games and how developed that lore actually is. It is a setting, in many ways, akin to the Elder Scrolls. But what about Enderal itself? It begins with a dream that soon turns nightmare, featuring a dead family, the consumption of flesh, and a father, apparently yours, although I don't blame you if you don't find him to be the most trustworthy source.
Bring me a nice crisp piece of meat! Bring me a nice crisp piece of meat! Bring me a nice crisp piece of meat! Bring me a nice crisp...
After this, you're given a brief recap of the story of Nerim, which, while not necessary, does help to have played, before the game begins properly with your newly created character stowed away aboard a ship bound for the island nation of Enderul. For once, you are not a prisoner, but you still get caught and almost killed before being thrown overboard, only to be saved by some mysterious magical intervention. Interestingly, of the 4 games featured in this video, 3 of them begin with some sort of shipwreck or accident that leads to the player washing up on shore. The only exception is Delusion, and even that game began on a ship. From here, after you're done admiring how muscular your back is, what the hell, he's not even flexing, you then have several short but largely linear walking and dungeon sections that eventually end with you getting ambushed by bandits and saved by Jespar, one of several prominently featured companions. The relatively long length of this intro gives you a bit of an indication of what's in store for you in Enderul. This game places a heavy focus on story, and free mod or not, it certainly doesn't lack ambition. Jespar provides you with a better introduction to the story, explaining that the people of Enderul have started suffering from something called the Red Madness, causing people to start going insane, and that you are suffering from something called Arcane Fever, which occurs when people awaken new magical powers, as you recently have. This fever will eventually lead to your death if not cured, and so finding a cure becomes your first big main story objective. Still, after this conversation, the game does finally open up. This is Enderul's Elder Scrolls moment, and unlike the previous games in this video, most of this world is theoretically open to you at this point, even if you are placed on a path that is trying to shepherd you to the first village. Still, unlike in Oblivion or Skyrim, this world absolutely does not scale to your level. In fact, one of the first lessons Enderul seems determined to teach players is to be careful and save often, as early game encounters can wreck you. Enderul's world is dangerous, and that's never more obvious than at the very beginning. What's more, unlike in the Elder Scrolls, healing is restricted, as each use of a healing spell or potion will increase the level of your arcane fever, leading to debuffs and eventually death unless you can reduce this level with a fairly rare elixir. Through this, Enderul fixes one of Skyrim's biggest design flaws, which is that in Skyrim you could just open the menu to eat food or chug potions anytime you're in danger, giving you an infinite get out of danger free card. By contrast, healing in Enderul can only take you so far and needs to be considered against its cost, and so finding beds to rest at as a way to heal instead becomes a necessary part of survival. In fact, early encounters are so vicious that you'll probably find yourself backtracking to the same beds multiple times as you slowly and carefully explore your surroundings. This caution is not very Elder Scrolls-like, but it does add plenty of excitement, as long as you don't mind the extra difficulty. The world itself still looks very familiar, which makes sense, but there are other subtle differences here as well. For one thing, it's pretty packed with points of interest, although that's partly because points of interest tend to be more clustered together here than in the more evenly spaced Skyrim. Secondly, far less of those points of interest are long dungeons. Skyrim is basically a world of dungeons, but by contrast, Enderul uses them more sparingly, and this actually helps incentivize exploration. In Skyrim, there's not much point exploring a dungeon if you don't have a quest that takes place there, as most dungeons are alike, and so many of them do feature in quests that you're incentivized to wait until you have that quest before clearing it. In Enderul, quests are less dungeon-centric, and you can often explore a handful of points of interest in the time it would take you to clear a single Skyrim dungeon, while being more likely to find unique loot or rewards in the process to make them feel worthwhile. The experience points these provide also feel more rewarding, as Enderall's world lacks level scaling. Instead, the game starts you off in one corner of the map, which acts as the single low-level area, and then when you're ready to take the training wheels off, everything pushes you towards the main city of Ark, found in the map's center. From here, the world can basically be represented by a heat map, where the further you get from Ark and the center, the higher level things get, which basically allows you to head off and explore in any direction you like. It's just that danger will increase the further away you go. This is actually really clever. It's a great way to avoid the problems of level scaling seen in certain Elder Scrolls games, while still providing a respectable amount of freedom and openness. Of course, it's not as much freedom or openness, but it feels like a solid compromise, and I wish more RPG developers would look at this template for how to implement leveled zones in a more organic and open way. The progression is also well done, and again breaks tradition from the Elder Scrolls. Level ups come from XP rather than skill use, but do give a familiar choice of health, mana, or stamina. The skill system, however, is completely different, with level ups providing learning points that can only be spent by reading skill books. This is how you increase skills, and these books provide a continuous gold sink to make money feel valuable from the game's start all the way until its end. And as money is always useful, it means loot you find stays rewarding, which creates a much more satisfying feeling of progression than in most RPGs, even if actually returning to merchants to buy and use skill books becomes a bit tedious. Levels also give you one perk point, but unlike Skyrim skill trees, Enderall's perks are much more limited and try to force you to only focus on a couple of different trees. So you cannot be a stealth archer who is good at magic, melee, lockpicking, and speechcraft. Instead, you're forced to specialize to get most of the very best skills, which involves sacrifice. For example, most players won't be able to pick difficult locks without heavy investment, so if that's a problem for you, you better get used to buying lock opening scrolls. Likewise, don't expect to be good at multiple schools of magic or completely different combat styles. This makes your choice of build feel much more impactful and improves replayability, even if some players probably miss being good at everything. And so, Enderall feels intelligently designed and makes some clear improvements to Skyrim's RPG systems. Where its status as a free mod becomes more obvious is in its many bugs and occasional presentation problems. I am not someone who complains about bugs very often. I'd like to think I have a high tolerance and can look past a lot of jank for the right game. But Enderall did test my tolerance. The infrequent humorous mishaps are one thing and have a certain charm. The frequent NPC pathing problems or breakable quest scripting is less charming, and I had to reload the game far more than I'd like to force quests and NPCs to behave. This is understandable given the size of this game and its small number of developers, but it still hurts the player's experience. The writing can also be mixed, although its average quality is quite high, and there is plenty of it. Maybe a little too much, as some NPCs seem in love with the sound of their own voice in a way that screams overly self-indulgent writing. But the problem is much more one of inconsistency than quality. Needless to say, I was rather grateful that dialogue choices often allow you to ask for shortened explanations, while marking which dialogue is actually optional. And yet, at its best, Enderall's writing can be great. Quests like A Song in the Silence, which is the one where you meet Rhynius, arguably surpasses anything seen in a recent Bethesda game, and the main story itself is surprisingly deep and takes you to plenty of unexpected places. Still, the single most impressive thing about Enderall is just how much this game includes for a free mod. This is a 90-hour game, and it's fully voice acted, and that voice acting is usually really good. The city of Ark is far bigger than any city in Skyrim, and probably even bigger than the Imperial City in Oblivion. The world has multiple distinct biomes, some of which look downright gorgeous, and nothing like the world of Skyrim. There are 2 entirely different gambling minigames, there are reputation levels with important characters, there are multiple different romances, there are guilds to join, side quests to take, hidden items to collect, and then there is the soundtrack, which has 122 tracks, according to the playlist on Sure AI's YouTube channel, and nothing about this soundtrack sounds like it's from a free mod. In fact, there are many times you have to wonder how exactly this game was possible. It just feels too big and too high quality to fit its free status. Things like the voice acting, which is in both English and German, just doesn't seem like it should have been possible. Except, it was. At other times, however, it can be hard to ignore the fact this game is a mod, because so many of its assets and visuals are reused from Skyrim. I mean, I'm sorry, but these are Dwemer automatons, not Starling Guardians, no matter what the game or I tell myself, and things like this does diminish what's here that tiny little bit. And yet, that feeling of familiarity being taken too far is rare. Most of the time, Enderal has a strong identity of its own, and it's one that is pretty different from any Bethesda game, which ends up being one of the best things about it. There is true joy to playing a game that is big enough to get lost in, where you don't know quite what to expect. This is one of the things that made the Elder Scrolls series stand out to begin with, but love them or hate them, Bethesda's open-world RPGs since Oblivion have become formulaic. They might come in 3 different flavors now of fantasy, post-apocalyptic, and sci-fi, but there is so much shared DNA between all of these games. The world design, the dungeons, the factions, the writing style, the NPC faces, the environmental storytelling. If you play one of these games, you know what to expect from the rest, and even Starfield, a brand new IP, barely changed this established formula. But in Enderal, this is not true. It may look exactly like a Bethesda game, but it breaks so many of Bethesda's rules. The world is dangerous. The writing is serious. The skill system is all about specialization. The quests are inconsistent but varied. The quality control isn't as high, but that's okay because it just adds to the unpredictability. And ultimately, Enderal is unpredictable in a way Bethesda games aren't, which ended up being my favorite thing about it. But it is this exact quality, the main thing that makes this game great to me, which also means it's not really a Skyrim killer. Enderal is not an Elder Scrolls successor. Do you want to know what game Enderal is a spiritual successor to? Well, I already told you in the first line of this section. I mean, what do you expect from a German developer? This isn't Elder Scrolls. This is Gothic, just in Skyrim's engine. And that engine means there is a lot of immersive features. Most games don't model every item, or have such detailed NPC routines, or feel this alive. And Enderal also provides a lot of freedom, more so than most RPGs, while almost matching Skyrim's scale. But at its heart, even this game, one built entirely in Skyrim's own engine, using Skyrim's own assets, is not truly like Skyrim. And so, the quest to find an Elder Scrolls successor goes on. Where are all the Elder Scrolls successors? Well, maybe they're still out there. There are more contenders in development. The Wayward Realms is a very deliberate attempt at this concept from renowned Elder Scrolls veterans Ted Peterson and Julian LaFay. Wayward Realms had a successful Kickstarter in 2024 and has all the features a Skyrim killer would need, with an even larger scope thanks to the use of procedural generation to help create its massive open world, and its Unreal Engine 5 graphics ensure it looks good enough that it could have mainstream appeal. The Wayward Realms doesn't exactly seem close to release, but it does tick every box an Elder Scrolls successor needs to, and at least proves there is real interest in the idea. And for contenders that aren't so far off, 2025 is meant to bring at least 2 more promising indie attempts. The World of Antera also had a successful Kickstarter, this time back in 2022, and has been called a pixel art Skyrim, featuring an interactive, non-linear living world. There are plenty of indie games that have found success by combining ambitious concepts with simpler graphics, and so the idea of using a low graphical fidelity to achieve some of the Elder Scrolls harder to replicate features does make sense. I'm less convinced about it actually achieving its stated 2025 release, however. But for a game that does seem likely to make it this year, in early access anyway, there is Ardenfall, a low-poly first-person take on the concept that takes clear inspiration from Morrowind and has had a playable demo for several years now. That said, this doesn't exactly feel like a lot of contenders, and the most obvious conclusion of this story is surely that making a Skyrim-like game is hard. All games face limitations on resources, and once those limits start being reached, how can a developer justify optional features or extra details over the more necessary pillars of gameplay and story? This is what happened with Avowed to cause it to change mid-development, and it probably happened with other games before it. Simulated worlds are complicated, and complete openness only works if there's enough optional content to justify such a high level of freedom. For indie games, this challenge becomes even greater, and the advantage brought by lower graphical fidelity is hardly enough to make creating something of comparable scale and scope to Skyrim achievable for most developers. It's a bit like trying to create an indie MMO. There are just some types of games that work better with a limited budget than others, and a Scrolls-like is not one of them. These are games where bigger is better, and everything can impact immersion, and even Bethesda has struggled with replicating these aspects in future titles. In the meantime, there's always Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which I didn't mention here mostly because I covered it in my last video, but which is about as close as you can currently get to a AAA Skyrim killer. Kingdom Come might be more main story focused and lacks that Elder Scrolls level of freedom, but it still offers a simulated open world full of immersive systems, which are arguably even more immersive than that of Skyrim. I'm personally hoping the success of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 helps renew interest in more systemic-driven open worlds over the more dominant, copy-pasted checklists of the Ubisoft approach, but that is a hope, not a prediction. Otherwise, there's always the Oblivion remake, which has not been announced as of me recording this, but has been rumored since I started this video, and if those rumors are correct, will probably end up surprise releasing around the time this video is finished. I'm not sure what the quality of the Oblivion remake will be at this point, but even if it's bad, I bet it will still sell a massive amount because there is an obvious desire for Elder Scrolls-like games that no one else is currently meeting. And finally, if all else fails, there's always the Elder Scrolls 6, which will have to release one day. I mean, it has a better chance than the Winds of Winter, at least. God, if you could go back in time and tell my 2011 self that in 14 years there would be no new Song of Ice and Fire books and no new Elder Scrolls games, I would have probably just ignored you and kept walking. But it is still hard to believe. For now though, the Elder Scrolls stands largely alone, and the longer it goes unrivaled, the greater its legacy will grow. Thank you for watching. If you want to support these videos, you can do so via Patreon. All support is appreciated and helps me to make these multi-game videos. The next video should be the next entire history of video, although don't hold me to that.